Brian, most handsome man in strength and conditioning. Pleasure to have you this morning.
Hey, Labs is here.
Yeah, man. No, I appreciate you jumping on, and I definitely miss seeing you more often, man. So it was good to catch up here. But no, I appreciate you having you on, and definitely looking forward to what we got today, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Pleasure to be here with you guys. I've heard your podcast. Told you I love it. I love how in the weeds you guys get, and I think it's a good resource for coaches. So it's an honor to be here, and thanks for having me.
So you started out 12 years ago, 14 years ago now? Been a while, 15 years ago now?
Are you going to make me sound old? Yeah. It's coming at me. It's early.
You started out at Sparta Science, and we're kind of, I guess, like an early adopter of a lot of the force plate stuff in the human performance setting. And obviously that's kind of been a mainstay for you over the years. But something I've always been interested in from you is like what's changed, what's been reinforced. Like there's been a lot of evolution with force plate implementation over these years, and you're probably one of very few that have been there all the way through. So where did you start, and where are you at with that now?
Yeah, so actually, let's take it back. I was a minor league baseball player that washed out because of a lot of injuries. I think that's what fueled me into the field to start with. I had a lot of potential, but had a lot of injuries I dealt with all the time, and that drove me to go back to school and get my kinesiology degree at Arizona State. During that time, I did an internship with a guy named Keith Wilson at Pro Advantage Training in Tempe. And I realized at that point that I didn't know what I was doing with training at all. And he helped me get my first job actually out of college. I got an interview with the Anaheim Angels as an intern strength and conditioning coach. And I did that for a year. And then I got a full-time job with the Colorado Rockies in 2013. And that was really my first introduction to force plates. And I'll come back to this because it was a very impactful time in my life. And it really shaped the lens of how I still look at things today. Because of quality of life and how things go in baseball and the demand there, I quickly climbed the ladder there to where I was in the big leagues as a strength and conditioning coach. 162 games, roughly 180 days. It was the Rockies, so we weren't in the playoffs. It could have been longer, but I missed a couple friends' weddings. Decided this is not really the path for me. This is tough. I need more life balance. I went and started working for the Boris Sports Training Institute in Orange County with Scott Boris. So I was training his clientele exclusively there for a bit, and love it down there, as I was telling you, Danny. And then Phil Wagner, who was the CEO of Sparta Science, he ended up calling me and said, "Hey, let's come up here. Let's bring you up here and let's start working here." And so I did that, and I worked there for a handful of years. And then now I'm the director of applied sports science with a kind of a concierge group called MMVP. We work with high level athletes that are seeking, year round care, training, therapy, blood work, tactical skill work, all of the above. Whatever they need, we will do. And so that's a lot of what I manage now here. But a lot of what I do now is I use force plates, and a lot of it's the lens that was created at Sparta Science. And so a lot of what I learned at Sparta Science is still how I look at things. And I don't know if you guys know about Sparta Science, but it was in Northern California.
Yeah, I actually spent time with Phil.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, when I was playing rugby, I went to Sparta Science with Jordan was there.
Poster.
Yeah, who else was there? Who else was there when I was there?
So Phil Brady was a coach there.
Phil Brady, I remember Phil. Yep.
Yeah,
Scott was there.
Oh, Scott was there.
Yep.
Yeah, so they had a sweet facility where they were training a bunch of high-level guys. They were looking at ground reaction force, and they were training based on what they saw, and what they thought they needed. And that got brought to us at Colorado. So he basically came in and said, "Hey, you're going to look at these cuts of the force time curve, and we're going to make decisions on these." Do you remember what those were, Les?
He big on load, drive, explode.
Load, explode, and drive, which is
Yeah.
essentially it was rate, force, and time.
Yeah.
And there was no option of anything else to look at.
Yeah.
Like when he came in, it was very restrictive for us at Colorado, but we were dealing with a ton of injuries in 2012. And when I got there, the idea was we needed to make an impact on the health of our guys immediately. And so by just looking at that sequencing of load, explode, and drive, we can make better decisions on what their efficiency of the stretch shortening cycle was and where we could spend more time training. And really, if we only, the concept was if we only had 2 days a week to work with somebody, we better be damn surgical with what we're imposing on them. It better be towards something that they need, and makes it less injury risk or injury prone. And so load was essentially breaking rate of force development. And that was an average of 4 trials, on Hawken or Vald. I use Hawken now, so I'll look at breaking RFD there. So the initiation or creation of force, how can we create that force? And then I think the big piece that's overlooked is really the amortization phase within the stretch shortening cycle. What is your ability to effectively couple that eccentric portion into the concentric, and how much energy can we retain or transfer or redirect in another direction? So that was average relative concentric force on Sparta, that's going to be, relative propulsive force on any other system. And we looked at that from the amortization phase. But really, I think, if you're not able to redirect forces, you're not really going to produce a lot of concentric force, or at least not quickly. So that was kind of that middle piece that we looked at. And then we looked at overall time or relative concentric impulse and how long it took you to get there, and how long could you apply those forces. So relative propulsive net impulse or propulsive net impulse is another way to look at it. So essentially, we were looking at your eccentric braking, how quickly can we decelerate? How quickly could we couple, or how efficiently could we couple and go into the concentric version or the concentric portion? And then what was that output in the propulsive phase, and how long did you do that? And so the way that we looked at that from an injury perspective is that we need to be more focused on the balance and less on the ability to grow these outputs that they're already there. And the idea was health and longevity, and too much of one quality usually brought issues somewhere. And while a lot of it was theory, a lot of it was taken from what Phil had seen at Sparta Science and what Jordan and Scott had seen. So that essentially got brought in and was like, hey, this is how we're going to profile everyone coming in. We're not going to continue to program guys based on position. We're going to be way more specific with how they move. And then, that's how we're going to program, and that's how we're going to check guys consistently so that we have projective information across the board and we get it consistently. And that's really how it came in to me originally. And, felt super restrictive at that time, but in a way it limited what else I could be diving into and what else I could look at, which in hindsight was like a blessing, because I could understand what impacted those variables versus, my thoughts of what else we could be looking at that's a little bit more sexy, or, it might be more of an interest, output related wise.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating, because I remember being like, I went there as an athlete at Sparta up in San Francisco, and I had no context of force plates before that. Like, I think it was my first introduction to force plates in 2012, and I got the information and I was like, oh, this is great. Like, now what is that? Damn, that was a long time ago. 14 years later, has it influenced the way that you look at force plates now? Or just profiling in general? Because you mentioned a couple other things like blood work and other pieces, which I want to dive into. But it's influenced how you read force plates now and interpret the information now.
Yeah, I'm really still looking at the efficiency of the stretch shortening cycle. And so let's go back on that a little bit too from an injury perspective. So that data, if you were extreme load, you were in comparison to your ability to effectively couple that into propulsion, you were a higher ACL risk or a Liz Frank risk. And remember, this is compared against a massive database, a huge population. So we could essentially take a T-score, 0 out of 100, and where are you on there, and 50 being that average. So if you were much above that, or you had a large standard deviation above that, and your inability to couple that at amortization or in propulsion, we saw that as a risk. At the same time, if you were extreme explode, not a great use of your lower half, but really stiff and able to transfer force, sometimes too stiff, we saw that as an oblique issue, or a lot of times we saw spondy in individuals like that. And then at the same time, if you were extreme drive or like an over-reliance, on momentum without proper force production earlier in the stretch shortening cycle, you were like ligamentous stress, or you had some issues there where you relied a lot more on momentum, and that's where the stressors ended up going. So how could we program off that? And then at the same time, if you were minimally developed in those areas, like low load or ineffective ability to create force, we also saw that as like an ACL issue or an ACL risk. But that was a lot of where our tendinopathies were. Ineffective force creation, usually, around the knee or ankle issue. So they would sequence around that pain. And then inability to couple rate of force with propulsive force would typically be a lot of lumbopelvic laxity. That's where guys would lose it in that ability to change direction. Typically, we saw low back issues there. We saw groin. We saw sports hernia. Just think too much laxity in the system. So low drive would be, your lack of impulse. So a lot of force and not ability to extend or finish movements. So we tended to see a lot of soft tissue areas there. Hamstring, calf, adductors. And so much of that stuff came true. Not always, but like a lot of the stuff we tended to see in these styles of movers. So to this day, a lot of this holds up. So I still look at these phases. I've changed it the way I've looked at that amortization phase, I would say. I still look at braking forces. I look at braking RFD. I look at that information. I've changed, I think, my view of amortization into looking more at like force at minimum displacement.
Yeah, force to zero velocity. Yeah.
Like really, when you're coiled and at length, like you're very vulnerable in that position. How well can you hold on to force, and how much force can you produce at that moment? I think, and I shout out to Daniel Bove and some of his work. He mentioned that's a lot where a lot of non-contact injuries likely occur, is at that moment when you're extremely coiled, muscles are lengthened, and you're about to change direction. So yeah, I use that more as my amortization phase now, but like it's still the same, because if you can't change direction at that point, concentric force is going to suffer, at least originally. So I'm looking at braking. I'm looking at amortization, at force at minimum displacement. I'm still looking at propulsive force, but I'm also still looking at propulsive net impulse. And so a lot of that is like, where is the individual spending most of their time, or where are they the best at, and where do they need work within that cycle? And a lot of that now, I'll still use normative information there. I'll also look at where they potentially have injuries, what's going on, where they're dealing with something, and where it relates to somewhere in this force time curve, and really prescribe or train off of that. But that was, I can let you guys ask questions from there, but like there was also some studies that impacted the way that I looked at that information at that time. It wasn't just word of mouth.
Quick pause here. I want to talk about the universal speed rating. So many coaches I meet are just overwhelmed. They're running sessions, programming, dealing with parents, and trying to prove their athletes are actually getting faster. One of the reasons why we built USR was to take some of this stress off the table. One software solution to help coaches test, track, and show improvement without adding hours to your week. If you feel like you're guessing with your speed training or trying to make sense of your data, hit the link in the description. Schedule a free consult and see how the USR can help.
Yeah.
I got tons of questions off that. And Danny, I muted you for a second, so you have to unmute if you have some questions. Well, my main questions were based around. I'm gonna recap some of the injury sites just so I understand. So, if you had low load, what was the injury sites off of that?
Yeah.
If you were higher, like relative to the other ones, what were the typical injury sites off of that?
If you were higher at load.
Yeah.
Yeah. So excessive rate of force. Typically we saw ACL and Liz Frank, and that was typically because a ton of force being created with the inability to then redirect that force.
Got it. Okay.
And that was very common, more so in the football population that we looked at, and the ability and the training that was going on there as well to enhance that without necessarily looking at the other side of the stretch shortening cycle. Go ahead.
Okay. And then drive, what was drive?
Drive was typically, extreme drive was an over-reliance on momentum, right? Without really, muscular force involved. It was, typically ligamentous stress. And we actually saw that kind of played out in a baseball study that we did over 4 years as well, which is, there's probably some faults in that study if you really dive into it. But I think ultimately, there was breadcrumbs there. There were some breadcrumbs and there were some clues to be had of like what was said in that data. And I think, some people knock that study, but it was helpful for us to understand how these guys moved.
Yeah. Yeah. And then explode.
Yeah. So explode, again, if you were extreme exploder, you were like a standard deviation and a half or more above the others. Typically, we saw that with an oblique wrist or spondy because of the overall wound up tightness of that midsection or torso, especially in rotary sports. It's not uncommon to see oblique issues there when there's too much stiffness. And then just to run that back again, you would probably see more of the other side of this, which was underdeveloped or injured individuals that weren't sequencing how they could. So low load or the inability to create force rapidly, which was usually a sequencing issue. It was usually something around the ankle or knee and the compensation around it. But that's where our tendinopathy was. That was guys that had knee pain that were moving around it typically. And then obviously to fix that, it's kind of a catch-22. We actually have to load that. We have to, and we can get into like what some of the methods were to train these, but they still hold true in my book, a lot of them. And low explode, again, the inability to create that stiffness to redirect force at that amortization phase is where we would see a lot of that torso issues, the laxity, the low back, the groins, the sports hernia. Because of that, when they leak that force, they have to recreate it. So you'll see that in a lot of these bimodal force time curves. You'll see the first shape, and then you'll see the dip, and then the second hump. And essentially that dip is the leak at that position. And so first off, we never had, force time curve. We weren't looking at force time curves.
Really?
That's kind of the craziest part is that we just had the numbers for load in, load and drive. And that's something
that's interesting.
Yeah. And that's something now that, using Hawkin Dynamics, like I've found tremendous value in looking at the force time curve. Yeah. And if you just look at something like the unweighting phase, the amount of information that you get as a practitioner in the unweighting phase, just looking at what might be going on with the ankles, is one piece that I wish I would have had earlier.
It's interesting because I see that even now, like people can spit off metrics, but they're not watching how people are moving, and then they're also not watching the force time curves. it's interesting because like I did this same kind of like thought experiment where I put up 3 force time curves at an event, and it was interesting to see like a lot of people were like, I don't know the difference between those. So yeah, it's super interesting. And you said now you are like, obviously you're looking at it now, and you're obviously using this as a profiling tool. How do you use it from a monitoring perspective? And then I definitely want to get into programming and some of Danny's questions, but how are you using it to like monitor long term with the athletes?
Yeah, long term, year over year, I'm trying to see where they sit with these as they come into the off season, or how we progress through the year, and also what they're dealing with physically. So from a monitoring perspective, I probably look at some other things, more time-based, some more RSI and takeoff velocity. And these I'm looking at as like true adaptations of how they're sequencing. Like, are they sequencing better? If rate of force is going up, in my opinion, it's not always because they're producing more force. It's because they can effectively sequence in that vector a little bit better. They can create that positive shin angle. They can create so they don't move around it. If I can't create a positive shin angle, I'm not going to produce force very quickly. Mm-hmm. So that's why the prescriptive side of somebody that can't produce rate of force or has low braking force, the constraint is a vertical torso. Mm-hmm. So like a common complex is a front squat paired with like a one leg hop to stick with a vertical torso. So everything is going straight up and down, and it forces the flexion at the knees and the ankles to produce that force, and it lights up the anterior chain. I would get much better results doing a complex like that with somebody than just doing squats or doing something where the angles weren't present.
Yeah.
So like for me, that's always what it comes back to in this phase or training, that is what are the angles of the pelvis, the torso, and how can we expose those tissues that are kind of being moved around or compensated around. And so they had a study back at Sparta, like that they looked at what would affect these variables. That was a pretty big study. And that's where like the light bulbs went off for me back in the day. Yep. They just, basically found what would improve each variable. And it was such a minimal study, but to me, light bulbs went off. If we wanted to improve, rate of force development, obviously it was like a squat or a deadlift. But what that also did is it improved rate in that amortization phase, but it also decreased impulse. Mm-hmm. So what we dose people with is going to have an effect somewhere else. And so we must account for that, when we train. If I take up specific qualities, another quality will become imbalanced.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, that's really stuck with me over the years. And every time I dose or I move a certain way, there's a cost to that. It might enhance their dominant system or harness what they do really well, but we're going to have a cost somewhere. And typically that's range or duration of force production in this case. So that study talked about, the squat and the deadlift could improve those, load and explode essentially, but it would decrease impulse. Bracing intensive movements would improve, that explode or that rigidity in the trunk, but it would also decrease impulse. And then what improved impulse and propulsive impulse was the split squat that came out of that study. But if you increased impulse, you decreased load and explode or that force. So there's a cost with everything. And then that's how my mind started thinking more about how do we balance these and who gets what can they afford to lose elsewhere if we enhance this system? Because, we need that balance no one's going to be perfectly balanced. That's just not a thing typically if they're elite, but we needed to find where that balance was to support some of these areas or tissues that were less likely to be exposed with their compensation patterns.
And what was the profile of like your best athlete? Like what relationship do they have typically?
Yeah, typically like a high force and amortization ability, or force at minimum displacement, and lower impulse. But your unicorn sprinters were actually kind of the other way. They were high force rate of force, they were high force at minimum displacement, and they were actually high impulse as well. Those were your guys that could get off the line fast and also start cooking even a bit more as they got going using that impulse. Those were rare because usually we saw force at minimum displacement and impulse to be inverse. You either took a long time for that, and impulse is force and time, right? So it's got to be one side of that equation. Either you produce a lot of concentric force, so you have higher impulse, or you spend a lot more time doing it. What part of the equation is there? And so a lot of the sprinters, those are kind of the unicorns that had, everything was very like equally high, but then they had impulse as well. So it's really, for me, just finding that balance. And so, I think, again, you talk about improving that slope. How do we do that? Well, the constraint is a vertical torso mostly. Plyos there, again, I'm going to enforce that. And then, how do we train that transition? How do we do that? So we want to raise that dip that I talked about, and we want to improve that force at zero velocity. And so like this a lot goes back to like reading triphasic training with Cal Dietz too, right? It was like, who can maintain stiffness to redirect that energy? How do we do that? And typically what part leaks it during movement? And a lot of it was through the torso, and that's where we saw injuries too. So the common complex, for someone that was training the transition or training the amortization phase, was bracing intensive or torso intensive. And it was a deadlift or like a suitcase deadlift where you're not letting it bounce. You are going to kiss and go, because that's how we know that you're locked in with that trunk. So everything was like, don't let me hear you hit the ground, like kiss and go. So we knew that they were locked in, hips were back. All of that force was then shifted to that torso area, that trunk region. And those are examples, but obviously carries, overcoming isos, yielding isos, oscillating movements. Those are all really good for that kind of contract, relax, redirect ability. And so we saw a lot of that, but we know that also will kind of torch the system a little bit. That's tough to maintain for a long period of time. But the guys that needed, if you could dose it in small enough amounts consecutively or weekly, actually responded quite well to it. And then the propulsive phase in training that, obviously you're just trying to expand that range or that force over time. And so, the way that from that study, it was like a common complex was, a split squat, a rear foot elevated split squat, or like a high box step up. And then your plyos were going to be more long ground contact times in nature. So your broad jumps, your acceleration bounds, all of those things, is we were trying to improve the ability for those tissues to move through a full range, but also produce force in that concentric side of it. So I think where I've changed a lot on that now is I'm doing a lot more, pneumatic resistance, the Kaiser squat. This is where I like to add in a lot of my accommodating resistance. Really get full extension of the system through an end range. And again, I think that helps us really kind of hit both parts of that impulse of force and time. So these have all stuck with me. There were clues early in that study of what were like one or two exercises that could impact those. And then I've evolved them. I think, Daniel Bove put out a really good resource in Takeoff where he kind of elaborated on these, what we had already been doing. And so, I've obviously adapted. Or I think the way that you have to understand, like the baseball side, when you're managing minor league baseball and major league baseball, is just like different facilities. So you have to be like, what does everyone have as an instrument to use from a training perspective?
Yeah.
And it had to be based on that. But now that I don't really have that issue, I'm definitely getting more creative in this with, my flywheels and the braking, and other things like that, and pneumatic devices. So
Who are you, like, what's your population that you're working with now? Like,
yeah,
who
good
you work
question.
with mainly? Yeah.
Mostly NFL and MLB and some overseeing of NBA right now.
And is it like in season? Are you looking at this during the season, off season, different parts of the year?
Yeah, mostly in the off season on the training side, and then in season I'll get periodic measurements, and then it's more so direct conversations with strength and conditioning staff and or our therapist on the ground. So I'm not getting as much as I would like in season to see how this balances out, but I think the way that I see it in my lens is, I think we always, as strength and conditioning coaches, we look at it as like, how can we enhance this in season? But really the sport is shaping their signature. And so it's really then where can we counteract or balance that? And so knowing what the demands are of some of these positions and the game, really it's like, how can we get back to neutral or reset in our time? I think there's a couple ways to hit the in-season training. And I think one of them is like enhancing the dominant system because it doesn't put much stress on them. It does increase hormone levels and recovery levels early in the week. So we can get that stimulus, but then we need to also be touching some of these, weaknesses or kind of training away, as some would say, right? We got to be touching these tissues that are not typically exposed. And if it's dosed in small enough amounts, there's not a huge general soreness or setback. If it was dosed in higher amounts and higher volumes, like you're gonna stress a system that an athlete is not capable of handling lots of volume at, like that you can really go in a bad direction.
And so from a weekly microcycle work, let's say you work with NFL player, they play on Sunday. When would you test on the force weights, and then when would you make the adaptations and changes?
Yeah,
microcycle.
I like to test every Monday if possible. When they go in for their lift, I like to test because a lot of that is actually going to be acute trauma impacts. So how do I change the sessions for the week based on their new movement pattern? Because it will be new. It's never the same on Monday. I mean, maybe. But I want to know where they're at in comparison to their norms on a Monday. A lot of times what I would see, and this was just when I was working with some other teams and talking with their strength coaches, is a lot of times you would see a spike in braking forces and a minimized impulse propulsively. And it was because oftentimes with the acute trauma, the athlete is moving through an abbreviated range of motion. So sometimes the CMJ is a good detector of like, we don't have it. We don't have it, and we're going to move around it, but we're going to do it because you said to do it. So in the NFL, ideally, I get something Monday. It gives me a good idea where they are week to week, how they stack up to their norms. And then if I'm being selfish, I want to get it again Friday.
Right. Yeah. So -2.
Yeah. Just to see if they kind of come back to where they need to get. What last minute adjustments can I make? If they're traveling, what do we need to do? And then also from a therapy perspective, if we are seeing some limitations within these ranges, especially something like propulsive net impulse, it can actually be enhanced with therapy because you're adding range to the system. We can get them to move through there. And there's other things I like to add in there too, like some BFR and other things to access deeper ranges. But a lot of times, again, because of the acute trauma, we have to like get them back to where they need to be sitting usually. So yeah, ideally I'm getting it multiple times throughout the week.
Yeah.
It's not always the scenario.
It's fascinating. Like Mark Lewis, who's with the Texans. Do you know Mark?
I know who he is. I don't know him.
He'll be on in a couple weeks. He's awesome. But he wrote a whole thesis about testing force plates in American football, and his thesis included like +1 testing, so day after a game, and then -2 testing, and then all the changes you can make throughout the week. So like basically you're capturing them at their highest fatigue state. And I like the way you put it. So it's a new movement pattern. And that's so true. It's like a lot of people are like, well, I don't want to test them when they're the most fatigued. Don't want to wait until they've rebounded. But you're missing a lot if you do that. Like you're missing a window of an opportunity to make changes on something that might be compromised. And you're not capturing a snapshot of like their most fatigued state throughout the week. And then you compare that to -2. That's their freshest point of the week. It's like the point where they've rebounded back, and you get to see like, okay, well, what did we change in that week? And then you look week to week, add up all the -2s, and that gives you a picture. Add up all the +1s, that gives you a picture. And you have insight into, where they're trending. So the preparedness over time. That's fascinating.
Yeah. And look, I also like to be extremely transparent with the data anytime I'm collecting it. And I think this goes back to kind of the early way that I was taught to look at this information and share it was I'm very transparent with it. I want the individual to know what I'm looking at. I want the individual to know why I'm going to make the changes that I do. And like even today with my NFL guys, like I'm showing them the force time curve. I'm overlaying it with their previous month's force time curve. I'm showing them the phase that we're, if we're working a braking phase, I want to be able to show them the slope. I want to show them the increase there, the higher mountain, whatever it might be. If we're working from a therapy perspective on kind of the ankles or dorsiflexion or ability to pronate or supinate there, I want to be able to show a better curve at the unweighting. So for me, like I try and be as transparent as possible with this information. And I also try and educate the individual along the way with what phases we're hitting, why we're hitting it, why we're staying longer in this phase. The hard part is usually when you go on to another phase, you haven't quite seen the true adaptation from the previous phase. Right. And I think that's where you're limited to the time that you have, but it's fun to show it when there is super compensation. It does arrive because usually it's with, something else you're measuring and you're watching them run and you're like, okay, this makes sense. Let's look at the data here. Mm-hmm. Your efficiency is improving and the outputs are rising. So those are good things. And so,
I have another question, but it's a distraction and it's a tangent. So I don't know, Danny, did you want to ask anything on this?
I mean, I'm just over here taking notes like I'm back in like undergrad. So no, I don't. This is brilliant though.
No, and that's. I'll go ahead fully if you had.
No, you're good.
Yeah, and that's one thing too is I'm always trying to, I kind of have my system that I operate in and the numbers that I like to look at, and obviously very transparent with it. I think my mind is always going to the model, and I was kind of running this with Danny earlier. It's like where can the therapy perspective really enhance or highlight phases I'm trying to go to? Is there a way that we can reduce co-contraction? Is there a way that we can allow better movement patterns in these phases? And what does the dosage look like? Because I think our group is doing some really good stuff with Gary Ward and some of his wedge work and a lot of the interaction of the foot at the ground, sometimes bringing obviously the ground to the foot and helping these guys kind of sequence better. And I know Danny's been able to see it a little bit out here with some of the therapists, but I'm trying to better understand that stuff to understand how it can impact and magnify kind of the loads and blocks I'm putting onto these guys too. So it's always something I want to go into.
Yeah, no, I mean, broadly, like we've had the exact same intention of work with different perspectives of looking at it. And I can speak to both of you guys on this because I've played this role for you both in some capacity. But, from the performance therapy lens, what we're looking to do is create an acute transient window that offers an improved opportunity for adaptation. So I think like the in-season examples that you were working through is a perfect illustration of this. We're banged up, hamstrings are stiff, feet hurt. We've been dealing with some nagging Achilles stuff. We're not coming in there with the mindset of we're going to make the hamstring pain go away or soreness go away. We're not going to alleviate the Achilles pain entirely. But what we are going to do is through different manual inputs or through different SMR inputs, different movement or breath inputs, we're going to create this transient difference in the tissue or in the body that is going to give us a 60 to 90 minute window where you guys can go in and do the precise loading or do the specific inputs with better return. And if we get better return arbitrarily, 10%, 15%, in an in-season period for a high-level athlete, that's a really meaningful difference. And we get that 2-3 times throughout the week. Now we're getting really some accumulation behind that. So whether it's transiently improving the range, or it's manipulating the ability to pressurize through certain portions of the foot, or it's the ability to desensitize pain in the hamstring, through those different lenses or through those different, ways of making a difference here, ultimately the outcome is the same. The athlete feels slightly better to hit the training floor, to hit the field, and they're going to get somewhat more out of those inputs. And now we have a collectively higher return on the back end. And I think between what I've experienced again with both of you guys, but then also too through the influence of Stu and how they have utilized performance therapy in the track setting, that's really the biggest misconception I think most people have with the therapy piece, or even if we take the word therapy out of it, right? And we talk about high school strength coaches, from foam rolling to, lax balls and SMRs and different mobility patterns. These things are not just passive in nature if they're done intentionally. And if we do them under the provision of how are we improving the opportunity to train, I think it changes the paradigm at large.
Yeah, that's really well said, man.
I have a distraction question now.
Bring it.
Can I ask it? All right. So obviously, like, force plates plays its role. What are the other pieces? You mentioned blood work. You mentioned, I forget all the other pieces that you mentioned, but like clearly, like, you're making decisions based on the health or performance of an athlete with this, bunch of different tools. Like, can you go into some of those, especially blood? Because I'm getting more interested into that. It wasn't on your script today, but yeah.
No, I love it. One other piece that we look at is a Springbox scan. So a Springbox analytics. So we get a muscle scan of a full body to see how, side to side looks like, what asymmetries we have. How does that kind of fit into their archetype and potential injuries they've been dealing with? So we get a good snapshot. And those are legit to have. It's just the athlete going and sitting in an MRI for 45 minutes to get a full body one. And they can look at, they're building a database too for sports and what that looks like in comparison with norms. So blood work, obviously we're doing, we've been able to bring in some performance chefs on this side of things. So really taking the information from, the 150 to 200 biomarkers that we're getting and translating that into, specific allergens or things that they have there, and where can the chef be providing things to, I guess, essentially limit inflammation and provide a solid foundation to stress more, essentially. We had really good results this last year doing that. We had an athlete that was going through some bloating and like carrying water weight and was not feeling good and was never hungry. And we basically did a gut reset and was able to lose a lot of that fast and get going in the right direction. So from the nutritional side, it's not something I'm an expert in, but there are people that are, and trying to arm them with the right information from the blood work has been extremely helpful. And then I think having some biomechanics video analysis done as well. Again, shout out to Gary Ward who helps our group a bit analyze, where shapes are lacking, where there's missing range, from even just walking down the hallway and walking back. Because if you just look at the simplicity of somebody walking and the issues that you can glean just from watching that, the lack of range on one side, the movement on another side that's not apparent. Like, if they do that all day, what happens and what are they ingraining into the system with how they operate, and then how can we provide some value there in terms of accessing ranges or positions that they tend to avoid at all costs, even like just subconsciously. So those are a big part of our initial like sit down profiling piece, and then the other piece is obviously just talking to the athlete. What do you want? Where do you want to be better? How do you want to feel better? What's gone well for you? What about this process do you like and not like? I think a lot of that is just the openness and transparency with what they're really looking to get, instead of me just saying, hey, you need all of this. So that's been a good feedback loop, I think. And then ultimately I'm trying to validate all of it through the numbers, where I can, just me speaking candidly. Like that's what I'm trying to do, is therapy sessions, table work, nutrition. It all comes back to what you're seeing and how they sequence and their efficiency there. So, and the metabolic cost that it takes to get to the same spot. So like, that's all a thing.
All right, we got to take a second to talk about the universal speed rating, because I literally just found this out and it blew my mind. We just hit over 500,000 verified speed tests inside the USR software, 500,000. That's coaches all over the country testing, tracking, and proving athlete progress with the system. It's not just data. It's giving athletes confidence and giving coaches real proof of results. I remember running our first Speed Lab test back in 2019 in a closet that my uncle helped me build, now 500,000. If you're not testing speed yet, or you're doing it without a system, this is your chance to check it out. Hit the link in the description, book a free consult, and see how the USR could work in your program. Yeah. You mentioned our group a few times. Who is that group?
Yeah, we got the Vin Fam is one of our rehab PT. Him and Mike Mancias really started this whole thing. So Mike Mancias is in LA. Vin Fam, and then there's myself and Jason Park is our director of performance therapy. Danny Foley has gotten to work with him here and there, and then we have some other people that are involved on more of a contract side. But don't want to forget John Lee is one of the therapists that we work with. He's extremely brilliant in what he does too. So we have a large kind of network of people that we can access when we need, but it's that's really kind of what it looks like right now.
And in the way you guys work, like who do people take leads at different times, or like is there a person that kind of directs everyone? But yeah, okay.
So I'm kind of like our training lead. I'll direct everything on this side from a data perspective, from a training emphasis perspective. All of that, I'll tend to lead that, whether they're with me here on site or not. And then obviously it's a conversation with everybody, but I'll kind of run that side, and I'm located here in Dallas, and then a lot of the team is in LA. We do have a facility in El Segundo. So we do have that as well. So these are kind of our hubs at the moment, although we have athletes that are elsewhere that we fly to, or that we work with, or we see them when it works. But our kind of two hubs right now are Dallas and LA.
I love it. All right. Sorry for the diversion. Didn't even get back to the script. Do you want to go through balance and precision?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's we kind of where we left off a second ago. Like the one thing that was coming to mind for me is really focused through balance and precision. What are those primary changes from in to off season, and where does that priority list kind of go to for each? Maybe some of that being like specifically within the training context, but then also more generally the distribution between how much time are we spending training and how much time are we spending for more of a therapy or a restorative lens.
Yeah, off season is a bit different, as you guys know. So you got some ability to do a lot more. I really hope that the athletes can make enough adjustments and balance out in a GPP phase, where we're really hitting a little bit of everything to really kind of balance them out after the end of the season and the stressors that are there. And then I think really what do they look like from stretch shortening cycle? Where are they efficient? Where do they lose it? Where are they good at where are their weaknesses, so to speak. And then I'm really in the off season still trying to hit all of these pieces of the puzzle of the stretch shortening cycle, but I would definitely tier or weigh my system more into where they need, in my opinion. And that's going to be based on comparative norms and or injuries that they are dealing with. So if I can spot that by location on the body and line that up with where in the stretch shortening cycle they are the weakest, I will spend a lot more of my time in that period. And I really think, because look, if I just look back at my time in Colorado where we did a lot of this, it was a lot of training weaknesses. And I think we had a lot of conversations about, like, why aren't we always gearing up their strengths? That's why they're here, right? They're here because of this, and we're not going to touch it. If we fast forward the 4 years that I was there, at the end, we had decreased injuries in over half, and we were in the top 5 in the league in injuries in that time. So that really, and so it was like, are we drinking the Kool-Aid, or does this work? And so from my perspective, with the athletes that I'm working with now, it's not about really raising any more strength or some of these sexier outputs. It's a lot more of managing the availability and making sure that they feel good to do their job. So off season, I will still touch these qualities regardless. I would touch them all, but I'll spend more time where needed. And then in season, it's going to depend a bit. It's a bit of a balance there of, again, I think more to my point of touching the dominant system and harnessing that. I think to almost boost recovery and get them to feel good. And then there's times throughout the week where we have to touch what the sport is not giving them. And I think a good example of this is even Andrea Hootie back in the day when she was at Kansas. I used to talk to her quite a bit. In the basketball side of things is start, stop, fast, as fast as you can, change direction, all of that. So what they're getting on the court is going to be probably opposite of what she's going to feed when their training session. And that's counterintuitive. And it seems like, well, what am I doing? Well, you're really placing some balance in there and some, I like the way that Hunter will put it, some slow force and some other things in there that we can add the resiliency in those structures that are being taxed at high levels in chaotic environments with high velocity. So in season, I kind of still have that lens of, I'm not going to go, I know that it can be stressful training a system that you're not very good at, but if we're touching it weekly, that stress dissipates and then it becomes normal. I think that mindset has worked well for me, but I do like to, again, if we got a long stretch and it's very stressful during a certain period, I'm not going to really crush somebody. But you got to pick your times to really kind of reach and push a little bit. So that probably didn't answer your question fully, but, and a lot of that's going to depend on what I'm getting back in the data too.
Nah, that's spot on, man. And I think it highlights a great point that I've been really emphatic about recently, which is of course, I'm coming from the health lens or from the therapy lens. So, again, I'm really trying to do my best to provide a good illustration of what the most effective things are for health. And the more that I do this and the more that I go into it, like we were talking before we started recording here, the most potent thing that we can do for balancing the system and for overall improving health and readiness is appropriate load and dose. The therapy stuff and the table work and the tissue work, all of it is great and fine and serves its purpose. But when you see that and do that as a standalone isolated thing, it's not effective over time. There has to be a redistribution of stress and load and how the tissues are being sequenced in order for these things to really kind of take hold. So it's again, like the way you were describing it there is exactly what I think is best practice, in that, we have to see health as also being training. They really are, an inextricable thing. And the better we are at seeing those as being infused rather than separate, the better the overall outcome becomes.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And the data is very helpful for me. And, I go back to some stories that I had, during my time in Colorado. It was if we had a guy come in and he was again, we're looking at these T-scores. He's 80, 80, 60. It's dude, go watch film. get the hell out of here. Like, honestly, don't even come in here. We don't need to improve these qualities. Let's spend our time better. And, when I talk about how do we balance this, precision or balance, like, we go back to that conversation of like, well, this is, let's take a guy in the big leagues that's a burner. He's chopping the ball in the infield. He's beating it out. You're not going to get him. You got that guy. Why would I not enhance that quality of just a ton of force production and very fast? Should I enhance that, or why would I train his weaknesses? And if we were talking about a certain individual and we're like, this guy has chronic hamstrings. He has them every year. So I think it's where can you shift your mindset to better understand what's going to suit them better, and would it actually help them? If you can access deeper ranges of motion, is that going to harness the genetic capability that you have currently with that rigidity and stiffness of the athlete that you are? Because that amortization phase, in my opinion, of the stretch shortening cycle is the most genetic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So do we always need to tap more into that, or can we add this balance, which will in turn allow them to reach a little bit deeper and get a little bit more out of their current system?
So we have in season, out of season, we have contextualized, differences through different sports. What you have talked about, for a while and have kind of leaned into is this force phenotype aspect or bucketing. Obviously we have like the James Wild quadrants and Daniel Bove's work, and a lot of people are doing this in different ways, Hunter as well. For you, as it applies to you, what does force phenotypes mean? And then maybe how does that just generally kind of change the approach to training? Pick your flavor, in season, out of season. But, just generally speaking, different athletes have different mechanical movement patterns, strategies, and et cetera. So how does that change the approach for you?
Yeah, I started these a long time ago. Actually, during my time at Sparta, it was just a really easy way to take something as complex as a force time curve or a counter movement jump and relate it to the athlete. I think that's where load explode drive came from back in the day. It was like, how can this relate to the athlete and how do they understand what you're talking about? So these phenotypes kind of came from that. You could sit there and be analytical and be like, well, you're an early peak bimodal force time curve. It's like, well, what does that mean? And so like we would have names for it, like the force leaker, right? Or the Mr. Momentum or the hinger, right? These are basic things that aren't scientific at all, but it helped them understand why they were getting what they got.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the hinger being a good example, right? Low braking force, but pretty good everywhere else in the stretch shortening cycle. That's usually a sequencing issue. And so if they can better understand why I'm getting them to be vertical in every movement they're doing to force that sequencing pattern that they're avoiding, they understood it. So the phenotypes for me are really just a better way to grasp something that's kind of complex and be like, oh, all right, that makes sense. I understand why this lift would work now. And I love the other, and then some of the work by, Rauch, where he did, the stiff flexor, the hyperflexor, and all of that. That's helpful. And I think that's especially helpful for people that might not have force plates. If you can see it and you can see, the stiff flexor being more elastic, or you can see the muscular driven mover using more impulse, these are helpful ways to just break things down for people. So for me, I have these archetypes to help me just very much think about what's important in the training, but it's also a big piece of how I discuss this with the athletes so that they understand what I'm talking about and understand why they're doing what they're doing. So I've still had these phenotypes. They still very much match up to what I'm looking at now. And, with the James Wild quadrants too, they match up, fairly well there too, with just the strategy and where typical injury locations might occur. So that's where when I left, when I got out of Sparta Science, I tried to go as far away from what I had been taught, because I felt because I was restricted and this is what I knew, that I got to get the hell out of that. I need to look elsewhere. I got to look at what other people are doing. And I look years later, I've come back to it. I hear you guys and Stu talking about these quadrants, and then I'm looking up my phenotypes and I'm like, this is the same. This is
So interesting.
And so these light bulbs are going off. And so it just comes back to efficiency of the stretch shortening cycle. Go ahead, though. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, it's all good. I was wondering, where's Phil right now? Is he still in the Bay?
Yeah, I think he's somewhere in the Bay. You know, obviously Sparta Science was acquired by Aura Ring.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm pretty sure he's still in the Bay Area. And like,
You got to reach out. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, like seriously, if you just look back, and I got to give him his credit, like everything I described at the beginning of, you know, low load, high explode, and all these things that just seem super rigid. It was like Phil was a pioneer in the way that he looked at this stuff because so much of it holds weight today. And while I've evolved certain things that I do and how I look at them, and, you know, the new system I'm using gives me a little bit granularity to dive deeper into the force time curve and some other things. That's great. But Phil was a pioneer in how he looked at this stuff. And also I think how he helped a lot of people, you know, shape their view in this stuff. And it definitely impacted me. And, but yeah, got to give him a shout and see what he's doing.
Yeah. That's awesome. I did not know he got acquired by Aura Ring. That's awesome.
Yeah. That was interesting. So that happened, I think, last year. It was acquired by Aura Ring. And so there are still like Sparta force plates out there. But I don't know if Aura supports that or what the deal is there. Obviously there was a large data piece of Sparta Science. So there's probably some of that involved in that acquisition, but, I don't know a ton about it, to be honest.
Yeah. Incredible. Yeah.
So we'll do this another time, but I think where my mind goes with you guys, and especially the combine presence that you guys have, and what I think about a lot when I hear you guys speak is really that precision versus balance and how you guys engineer that on your side. And like I said, this is a conversation for another time because I know we're about out of time, but my mind always goes to how you guys are managing that from an output perspective and preparing them for that versus the long term.
Well, yeah, I mean the depth of it would be a great part too for us, but to make a quick point on that, the interesting thing was that the archetype model is actually what unified the language and kind of the work outcome for Les and I. And, you know, when we first linked up, you know, earlier this year, it was the most difficult thing, as always, was the communication. It was what are we trying to say? Like, we knew what we were trying to do, but we didn't really understand how we were getting there. And then the more that I leaned into the archetypes of the quadrants from James Wild, it almost created a centralized language. And then from my points on the health perspective and his points on the performance perspective, it gave us this clear identification of differences between guys, what those work priorities were, and then how we were going to achieve that. And you actually like covered almost all of this brilliantly throughout this talk, but it was a lot of those things. It was, do we need to freeze or free degrees of freedom? Do we need to focus on pain sensitization, or do we need to focus on acute activation? Do we need to focus on the foot or the hip? And it really clarified a lot of things. I'm probably speaking mostly for myself here. It really clarified a lot of things in the directionality of work. But then I think it also, you know, really kind of, again, unified the outcomes that we were working for. And, you know, if we take a single example of this, like what we did with Katarina over the summer was brilliant. Like it was really, really good. Very smooth. Everything felt like it was, you know, congruent. And the, you know, the inputs, again, at least from my end, felt much more intentional. So I think with this era that we're entering of everybody, you know, producing radar charts and quadrants and archetypes and graphs, you know, I think there's a lot of different ways that these can have utility. But the important thing to understand is, like, especially if you work with other people or you work within a team setting, those archetypes and those quadrants need to express the same language from the health and from the performance side. And I think we were just able to achieve that. So yeah, I think it's a really important thing, man.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah. Well, I have a couple more like quick questions, and if you got a few minutes.
Let's do it, man.
So the first thing is like, what do you feel like our industry is missing right now in terms of monitoring or profiling athletes? Like, is it a piece of tech or a thought process? Like, what's missing right now?
Oh, good question. I think there's too much going on.
Yeah.
We're an inch wide, mile deep. It needs to be the opposite. So I think we need less. We need less things to look at. And I think that's what will help ultimately understand if like you're being effective or not. I think it's looking at less, in my opinion. So that would be my thoughts there.
I love that. If you could design a piece of technology today, we got $100 billion grant coming to you. What's that piece of technology?
Oh, man. I just want a 1080 over here, We're out there.
You're going to arrange it.
It's the nerd in me wonders a lot about more of the motion capture involved with all of this. We've created these archetypes. We've seen the study from Rauch where we can look at these different types of movers. I think blending them a little bit better would be helpful. I think not only for the coach, but for the athlete to understand some of these sequencing. So like just that's very low hanging fruit and it probably already exists. I don't know about it, but
me either.
Yeah.
Okay, last one.
The answer you were looking for. I have
it.
Creative cap on right now.
No, but that's good. I definitely. It's the same for me. It's more. A lot of it does already exist, but some of it's like the motion capture stuff, and then cheaper and easier, simpler.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Last question. What was like the most impactful moment of your coaching career? Or were you just like, man, this is it. I'm here.
That's a really good question. There's been a lot of people that have had a huge impact on me that have made or have had me feeling validated in a certain scenario, which is very selfish. But I think a lot of what we do is really just trying to give back and help people not make the same mistakes that we did in our athletic careers. I think I've been able to do that for a few people, but gosh, I don't know if I have an answer there. I wish I did.
No,
you're too humble, man. You've
done a lot of cool stuff. I've seen you on TV.
Yeah, I think there's been some people that I think recently that have brought me into their lives and given me an opportunity to be a small part of it, and seeing them succeed is like the most impactful thing for me. Like that's everything. So there's been some of that recently in my life. So I've been fortunate to see it. And it really makes like every bit of it why I do this. Like, it's just everything. So, I've been fortunate to be around some really good people that have been able to make me look decent at what I do. So that's been like very rewarding to see them be happy and them get what they wanted out of this ultimately. Not like me validating numbers to them, but them have success on the field. And like to see, like recently I had an athlete that like the whole town finally figured out who they were. And I think that like that was like missing in their life. And it was missing in my life. And I recently like saw the validation occur. And it was like one of the coolest moments of like my career.
Love that.
That's something that like I hold close for sure.
No, you're humble. No, I appreciate it. No, this has been a fantastic talk. And I have a ton of follow-up things that I want to go through. Like definitely want to reach out to Phil. He's probably sitting in a bunker, $1 billion mansion in the Bay now. But I remember the first day I met Phil, he brought me into his office and I was like, he was talking to me, but I was so distracted because there's so much writing on his wall. And I was like, what's going on in here? But he sat and talked to me for 45 minutes. And I was a low level athlete, like nobody important, and the level of attention that he gave me, and like he didn't care who you were. He was just like, I'm going to talk to you and you're going to learn about force plates today. Like it was unbelievable. I had no idea what he was saying, but now looking back, I'm like, man, like that that one interaction brought me to Jordan, Scott, you, tons of other people in our industry, and also shaped a lot of what we're doing now. It's funny how you said things come full circle. So it was interesting to hear that story about how you went to it, came back to it. And it's funny because like all the things that you brought up and mentioned is like kind of what I'm looking at when I'm viewing force plates, not even realizing like someone's done it before me on that side. So it's pretty cool to see. And I appreciate you sharing your perspective on it.
No, of course. I appreciate you guys hearing me out on it. And it's different for me to say it out loud. Like sometimes I think about what I went through and like kind of the ways that this got brought into my life and how I learned it and everything. And sometimes you think you're in a rabbit hole somewhere and that no one else is seeing the same stuff. And then it's good to, like your guys' podcast and what you discuss, like it's had me thinking a lot of like things I used to believe that I went away from that I came back to. And I think like that's been my career in a nutshell, is like you think you have something identified or figured out and you get away from it. And then something brings it back. It's been like, it happens to me all the time, actually. But I think that's like the most valuable part of like being in this industry is being open-minded enough to look elsewhere and look what else there is that can be done or how it can be done or who's doing it better than you, and then figure out, the best way to put it into your practice. So it's been that's a huge props to you guys and what you guys are doing here and the podcast and the voice that you're giving people. So I appreciate you guys.
No, for sure. We're going to have you back on soon after I round up Phil. And we'll get you back on.
Yeah, for sure. Anyway, you're gonna
appreciate you.
Yeah.
Oh no, you good, man. Yeah, just it's really nice in Southern California this time of year. Anytime you want to come out, man, and would definitely love to get you out for a couple of days for Combine, man. I think it would be a cool thing for you guys to chop it up for real.
Yeah, please.
And
please. I'm thinking December. I'm thinking before Combine. But let me get some insights going into Combine,
No, for real. I think there's a lot more we could dive into on the topics of the force stuff and all that. We just kind of skimmed it today, so we'll definitely have to do it more in person. I'll have to come out and see you guys and talk some shop.
No doubt.
Let's do it. Cool. Appreciate you guys.